So now that we've talked about how the individual is politically socialized, and we've talked about how public opinion shapes things, is formed, let's talk about how we can participate as individuals in shaping public opinion and in shaping the political process through elections and participation. So, to participate in politics, once you're 18, you have to register to vote. You can't vote if you're not registered. Now, in recent times, most states have made it pretty easy to register. When you get your driver's license, it's called motor voter registration. You can get registered to vote at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Back when I was young, you had to actually go to the City Hall and register to vote. And when you register, you register as a Republican, a Democrat, or an Independent. And there are some places that allow you to register as other members of a party. Now, why do we have people register to vote? I'll give you a hint. The governor of Chicago during the middle 20th century was a guy named Richard Daley. Richard Daley was the head of a Democrat big city political machine that ran Chicago for the Democratic Party. Daley's favorite slogan at election time is this: vote early, vote often. Now, innocently, as a kid, I thought that meant get to the polls early when it's election day, and don't miss an election day. Vote at all the elections. And maybe he meant that. Maybe he didn't mean that. In Chicago, there were political irregularities that happened during Daley's time. Irregularities like dead people voting. Irregularities that involved people using the voter registration identification of the recently deceased in order to vote a certain way. This sort of political corruption is something that can happen if you have loose voting rules. So in Idaho, we don't. In Idaho, we have fairly strict registration rules and strict voting rules. And what that means is that when we go to the polls, we have to present a photographic ID in order to prove who we are, and we are checked against pre-existing voter registration records. Now, that's all to prevent voter fraud. Voter fraud is a different way of looking at vote early, vote often, which is go to your own polling place, vote as yourself, then put on a hat and a fake beard and a belly pillow and go and vote in another district as someone else, and then vote in another district as someone else, and then vote as and sometimes people did this, and it can shape elections. It also disenfranchises people. That means takes the vote away from them who vote only once. Because if you get 8 or 9 or 12 votes and they only get one, stinks to be you with only one vote. So the system of voter registration is intended to prevent massive voter fraud. Now, voter turnout is, God, civics is so hard. What do you think it means, voter turnout? God, that's difficult. Maybe you got to look it up. How many people show up at the polls on a given election day? That's voter turnout. Now, in some places, not in the United States, voter turnout tends to be really high. For example, after we liberated Iraq in the mid-2000s, we began giving the Iraqis the right to vote, something they hadn't had before. To vote, you would have to dip your finger in blue ink, and that ink would dye your finger for days. The terrorists told the Iraqis, if you take part in this American election, we'll find you. And if you have a finger like that, we're going after you and your family. Still, under the threat of terrorists in their neighborhoods coming after them, the Iraqis had figures of 90+% of the eligible voters registering and turning up at the polls on election day. 90+%. In America, it's usually between 45 and 60%. In a good election, closer to 60, in a bad election, closer to 45%. That means that about half the people who could vote often don't. That's bad. Because if you believe in the democracy part of our republic, the way that people express their views is through voting. So you want people to show up and turn up at the polls. You want people to turn out. And if you're a political party, you want people to turn out who are on your side. This is why political campaigns will have buses on election day, and they'll go to old folks' homes, and they'll go to hospitals for people who can walk, and they'll basically do everything they can to get their party's voters to the polls. Now, of course, they say they're just helping any old voter, and they might have the occasional, Democrat in a Republican van, or Republican in a Democrat van, but usually it's to get their own voters to the polls. So increasing voter turnout is a way that the parties try to win elections. Obviously, the side with the most people who turn out tend to win. Now, one of the dynamics in American politics today is this question of voter registration and voter turnout. Many progressives and liberals say that Republicans try to suppress voting by making it harder to vote, harder to register, harder to turn out, because voting is so hard. And that this suppression is designed to prevent homeless people, mentally ill people, mentally challenged people, poor people, minorities of varying kinds, people who are marginal, people who are new citizens. In other words, the disenfranchised from voting. That Republicans want to suppress all of those, and the Democrats want to bring them all to the polls out of a noble desire to get more Democrats to the polls, because the Democrats assume, rightly, that most of the people in those groups are going to probably vote Democrat. So Democrats in modern times, over the last 20, 30 years, want to expand the number of voters. They want to reduce restrictions on registration. They want to prevent other states from adopting photo ID laws that will chill minority turnout, they say. They say that Republicans are trying to keep voter turnout in the low 50s, 50 percentile region, because if everyone voted, no Republican would ever win anywhere. That's their basic contention. Republicans, on the other hand, tend to explain that a lot of voter fraud happens. And voter fraud tends to be a product of urban political machines like Richard Daley's Chicago. And that you don't want dead people voting. You don't want people voting early and often, if that means voting multiple times in the same election. You don't want people claiming to be someone else. You don't want voter fraud. And that voter fraud is going to distort the electorate, it's going to distort public opinion, and it's going to lead to the election of people who otherwise would never get elected. This even plays out in the current immigration debate, because in the state of California, there are localities that allow illegal aliens to vote. They're illegal aliens. They're in the United States against the law. They didn't come here legally. Let them vote. That tends to be against federal law, federal election law. It tends to be against most state laws. California is different. Why would Democrats in California want to allow immigrants to vote even if they're here illegally? Again, they say it's because we want all human beings who live here to vote. Others would argue they're trying to increase the number of people who vote Democratic in any given election. We will continue.